Hi, Misha here, and this is part 2 or episode 2. And the first one kind of looked at the status of 4 different nations' bolt-action rifles during World War II. For 1941-42, we looked at Russia and the United Kingdom, and for 1944-45, we looked at Japan and Germany, really to see them at their, I don't want to say lowest point, but most economical, trying to crank guns out. And for the bolt actions, they were pretty all similar in terms of function. You know, a 5-shot, full power caliber, reasonably good guns. Now I want to talk about the sidearms, the pistols, or revolvers, automatics, because these are different. And again, for the UK, we're going to look at guns from 1942-43. We've got the Webley Mark IV, which while the Webley was the standard in World War I, by this point it was the limited standard or emergency use standard, whereas the Enfield number 2 was the official standard issue within the UK before, during, and even after World War II. Then for Russia, well, of course, we have the TT-33 Tokarev from 1942, kind of the lowest point, that in 43 for Tokarev production. But not to be overlooked, they were still not only using, but still building the 1895 Nagant revolver. Moving kind of over to the other side, and a couple of years later, Germany, 1945, we have 2 Walthers. I did consider bringing out a Luger for this, but because production was over by 42, I'll stick with this. So here we have the standard P-38, late war, and we have the PP, late war. There's a lot of pistols that Germany used, but I kind of thought these were good and representative for late war examples. And then finally, of course, it's me. We have to talk about Japan. We have a very late 1945 Type 14. And we have quite a late, also 1945 Type 94. Both of these are referred to as Nambu pistols. Now you'll notice we have some revolvers and some automatics on the table. Of course, during the war, everyone used all kinds of sidearms. There was far less standardization with sidearms than we saw with rifles, to be fair. And of course, lower production numbers. So, let's start with the Allies. And this time, let's begin with the UK. In a way, the number 4 revolver here actually predates the Enfield. And this fires 38-200, which was a British loading of 38 Smith & Wesson. And it might seem strange for them to go to a 38 caliber after having 455 in World War I. But that was a very heavy gun, very heavy cartridge. And after the war, they realized that a revolver was basically good for self-defense. So Webley and Scott developed the Mark III for police use. And then the Mark IV here followed for trials in the early 1930s. It's a double, single action, top break design, 6-shot. But who won the trials? But the Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield. And of course there's a huge story to be had about who ripped off who, what was going on. But nevertheless, this was adopted as the standard. Now the original number 2, move you up there, hope get something there. Number 2 Mark I was a double single action with a spur on the hammer, and it had wood grips. But beginning in 1938, they introduced the DAO, double action only version, first intended for pilots and vehicle crews and what have you. But after the war, what was known as the number 2 Mark I Star with the DAO hammer became a standard. It just or at least de facto standard. They also switched from wood grips to synthetic bakelite type, which were meant to help aiming and double action only, how to keep control. They also lightened the mainspring. And the finish would go from early on blued to more of a phosphate, and of course later the sunkerite, the paint finish we all know and love. So for 1942, they had a few economies on the gun. The machining quality went down a bit. The finish quality was very utilitarian. They kind of stopped worrying about the single double actions and just standardized on the double. They even omitted the hammer safety for a minute, known as the Mark I ***, but they quickly decided that was a bridge too far. Incidentally, they did the same thing with the Enfield No. 4. They deleted the half-cock position temporarily and decided, no, that's not good enough. But in 42, they just didn't have enough Enfields. So they adopted the the Mark IV here as a substitute or limited standard, giving Webley and Scott a contract. Very similar guns, although these were still double single action. They had synthetic grips, and they had what's known as a wartime finish. It's still blued on these, at least originally, but the far less care was taken for the machining just to get them out the door. So both were used extensively, and effectively both are the same, reliability-wise and all that, but they're not interchangeable on parts. The trigger system, the lock work for the Enfield is different from the Webley. Nevertheless, Britain would produce nearly 400,000 Enfields, and, well, Webley and Scott would produce several 100,000 of the Webleys here, although some of them were for, police contracts and civilian sales. It's worth pointing out that they both stayed in British service after World War II through Korea, and were not officially retired until 1963. So they were adequate for what they wanted. It's a little odd to think of a 6-shot 38 revolver. And so the gun itself was kind of an economy measure, much as they'd used the Enfield instead of going to a semi-auto. They felt that a revolver still fit their needs, and suppose it did. But Russia had always been interested in semi-autos, self-loading guns. Stalin really liked self-loading guns, but early on they mostly focused on rifles. You had the 1916 Fedorov, you had the AVS-36, and of course the SVT-38 and SVT-40, also designed by Tokarev. But in 1930, they first adopted this pistol, at least the TT-30 version, the Tulas Tokarev. And in 1933, they introduced a slightly updated and simplified for mass production. And again, much like with the Mosin, this gun was already streamlined for mass production. No screws in it. You use simple split pins. It could be made on pretty simple, primitive tooling. No safety except for the half-cock, because let's be honest, in Stalin's Russia, you had bigger worries than getting accidentally shot with a gun because the safety was malfunctioning. And pre-war guns had a decently high-gloss blued finish and black synthetic bakelite type grips. But the Tula factory, which was the primary producer of these, at least in the beginning, was overrun, at least under threat of, by October of 1941. So it had to be evacuated, and its machinery was moved to where Izhevsk was at. And they would relocate and start up production in 1942 using different symbols. And that's where a gun like this comes from. Now this is a bringback, so, rough shape. But even in the beginning, these had pretty rough machining marks, and they had a really thin, grayish, blued finish. They were blued, but not phosphated, but it was a real thin blue with a lot of the kind of metal silver shining through. It was adequate for being bluing, but nothing more. More importantly, they switched from the synthetic grips to these simple checkered wood grips. And they would continue to use these until about 1944. But they couldn't produce enough Mosins, and they didn't have enough Tokarevs. Before the war, there was only about 600,000 in service, and because of having to move the factory, they only built about 160,000 in 1942. Thus, while the Tokarev was to replace the 1895, it really didn't, not until 1945 and the end of the war. Not only did it not replace it, these were produced not only at Tula, but also Izhevsk during the war. Now, originally, during World War I, they had both a single-action and a double-action version of the 1895. Well, with the communists, the egalitarians, they decided everyone needs a double-action revolver, 7-shot, yeah. So they discontinued the single-action only enlisted version, going to just the double single-action officer's model. Now, originally these would have walnut grips and then birch, and then later in production they would go to synthetic bakelite grips. I grabbed this one because, I don't know, the wood grips are kind of neat and match the Tokarev over there. So these were definitely a standard and widely used throughout the Red Army during the Great Patriotic War. They would build about 1,700,000 Tokarev pistols, most of them during the war, and they would build about 2.5 million Nagant revolvers, all told over the generations, but a good chunk of them were built in World War II. The Tokarev pistol would continue on in frontline service until being replaced by the Makarov in the 1950s. But it really wasn't until the 60s and even 70s that some people gave these up. Even the Nagant revolver continued to be used by police in Russia, as well as the railway authority and some military officers that just liked tradition. It worked for them. It was a very Russian way of doing things. So the major takeaway during 1942-43, the machining kind of went down, the bluing became more thin and utilitarian, and they replaced the synthetic grips with wood. But by 1944 and into 45, they would go back to kind of early war and then pre-war standards. But as far as comparing these, the Nagant revolver is a Nagant revolver. It's durable, reliable, but relatively small, 30 caliber bullet. But the Tokarev pistol, while it's not perfect, it was a great, reliable self-loader, and 7.62 by 25 Tokarev is a hot little round. So this wasn't a bad gun at all for World War II, and it was actually a pretty advanced pistol, and because of its design and construction, they could turn these out even under duress. But of course, as we said with the rifles, by 43 and really into 44, things were improving for Britain and Russia, and going downhill quick for Germany and Japan. The P-38 was the standard issue gun for the Nazi German military even before war began, even though the Luger is quite famous. But actually, let's talk about Walther's other gun, the PP, first. This is a 1945 example, and I'm mentioning it first because in 1929, it was really the beginning of double single action is a successful design. Now, of course, it's firing 7.65 32, and the smaller PPK would appear a couple of years later. But the PP was really the one used by militaries and police en masse, even though the PPK is more famous. And the German military and police and several civilians would order these throughout the war. Of course, this is a simple blowback gun, although of course it has the decocker safety. Now, during the war, Walther would get the code AC and would build these along with the P-38. The PPK, believe it or not, they would stop making them. Well, it's kind of confusing a bit. The last one seemed to be 1942, but then they built some from existing frames, like the Dural frames, as late as 1944. But after parts were used up, that was it for PPK production. But PP production persisted. And they introduced these slab wood grips in 1944. And in 1945, they went to the simple slide legend of AC. By this point, they also have very simple military bluing. They've eliminated some machining work, like right here on the hinge pin that used to be stepped. It's not. There's also some work up here that's been eliminated. The sight is still patterned a bit, but it's very much simplified. The ramp here. Safety is simplified. And we even have some phosphate parts, like the magazine. They're starting to use phosphating. But they would build these up till the end. That's because Germany really, they like their little 32s. And the same thing can be said for a lot of factories producing guns for the Nazis. Beretta, FB in Poland, and so on. But I wanted to show that to talk about this. This took the double single action system of the PP and PPK and the decocker and combined it with a locked breech so that it could fire the standard 9x19 cartridge. And in the beginning, while the P-38 never quite has the mystique of the Luger, these were high quality pistols with a high gloss blued finish, a lot of serialized parts, and so on. But already by 1942, they start dropping a bunch of serials, like on the grips, for example, and even the mags, to the point only 4 parts get them. And the grips go from black to kind of a chocolate color to reddish brown. And the finish goes to more of a military grade. And Mauser and Spreewerk will join Walther in producing these, although Walther still makes the majority during the war. Functionally, there aren't many changes. In fact, they improve the extractor a bit here by going to a beefier one. They also reinforce the frame here in the trigger pin area. That was done in 42, 43 period. In 44, though, we start to see hasty machining. And by this point in 45, we have a number of late war features. For example, we have a stamped, not machined release here. We also have what's known as the cog hammer, very coarse grooves. This gun also has some phosphated small parts. Mauser would go whole hog with the phosphating. Walther still blued a lot of their parts, though. The machining for the barrel is noteworthy. A lot of these were subcontracted out to other companies as well. And the grips. Late war grips can be red or brown, but you can also find these that are this kind of glossy black plastic, which is actually really, I would say, an improvement. The magazines, too, late war mags, are this kind of yellowish white color, and they eliminate quite a few markings from them, and some of them late aren't even fully heat treated. You know, they kept the quality pretty high at Walther, and Mauser for that matter. The roughest ones seemed to come out of Spreewerk, but they were all fully functional guns. Perfectly safe to shoot. And, yeah, they just kind of draw upon each other there. Walther kind of set the stage. Germany certainly had the most advanced sidearms of World War II, I would say. And, of course, production for both of these would continue after the war. They would build about 1.2 million during the wartime for the P-38. I'm not really sure on the PP because its numbers kind of get wrapped in with the PPK and then post-war, but millions have been built. and they equipped the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine and what have you, and they continued to produce them right up to the end. And of course, after the war, Mauser would produce more under German French occupation. Kind of reciprocity there a bit. And again, there's tons of little 32s and even several other 9mm you can talk about with Germany. However, with Japan, things are both more complicated and simple. Now, both pistols here are classified as Nambus, and both fire 8mm 8x22. Not as ineffective as 32 or even maybe 38 Smith & Wesson like the Brits use, still nowhere as good as 9mm or Tokarev. Now, in the beginning, the Type 14 was actually a very good pistol for what it was. It was known for having a nice trigger pull, actually being quite well balanced, quite accurate, good feeling gun in the hand. But of course, as we know, it deteriorated quite a bit in the war. And this was the standard, although up until 1943, officers were expected to purchase their own pistols. After 43, as the war really turned, then they started being more and more issued. Now this is a Torematsu from 1945. Before the war, really you had pretty limited manufacturing. Tokyo, Kokura made some, and Kakibunji would make them for a while by itself. But in 1941, Nagoya would set up a new factory known as Torematsu, and it would ramp up production right around the time of Pearl Harbor. And it and Kakibunji would produce them for some time together. And by 1942, they started doing some simple economies by going to more simplified finishing, more blued parts, less strawed, no longer doing nickeled magazines. But in 1944, things really took a downturn. Now, Kakibunji would stop making the Type 14 in August of 1944 entirely. That's so they could focus on the Type 94 here. But Torematsu would continue, and they had already introduced that year several simplifications like the simple round cocking knob, and they also started machining the trigger pin flush here earlier. But towards the end of the year, they went from lined wood grips to slab side wood grips, which are not as durable, to say the least. And you'd think not having lines in them, they'd be more durable, but maybe it's the quality of wood they used, but yeah, they're pretty delicate. And the machining would just go downhill quite quickly through 1945. The blowing would become thinner, darker, and just less even. And the magazines and all that would deteriorate as well. But they would keep making them. They would keep making what are considered new production guns up through about June of 1945. And then in July and into the beginning of August, they would produce what are known as last-ditch guns, true last-ditch. By this point, they really didn't have the capacity to make all new parts, so they scavenged what parts they could from defective guns, previously rejected guns, even partially damaged guns that had come back in from the field. So the last 6 weeks or so of Type 14 production were very haphazard. But this was the standard, at least as much as it can be said to. And estimates range from 270,000 up to about 300,000 built. So, yeah, not a huge number, but yeah, for Japan, and considering how relatively unimportant they felt the pistol to be in their system, it's still a big number. It's still the largest produced pistol that they had. And finally, the Type 94. This really has more of a claim to Kaijiro Nambu's name than the 14. The 14, well, originally he made what we know as the Papa Nambu, the Type 4. And during World War I and after, Nambu worked on simplifying it for more of a mass production standard issue gun. But in 24, he retired from the military, and the project was taken out of his hands. So a lot of things with the Type 14 were added by committee, for example, the awkward safety. But he went into private industry and set up his own factory, and it would start making Type 14s around 1935. But in 1934, it was requested that he design a more affordable gun to mass produce and a smaller gun for planes and tank crews and for, more modern military combat. And in 1935, he introduced this design. It was accepted and put into production. And in the beginning, it was a pretty high-quality gun. He even addressed some of the shortcomings of the Type 14. For example, the 14 had a striker firing system that gave a very nice trigger, but it was kind of brittle, weak, and prone to breakage. Well, the Type 94 is the opposite. It's a hammer-fired system, but the trigger kind of sucks. But early on, these were high-quality guns. But even before World War II began for Japan, at least with the Pacific America, they simplified the frame machining here and the sear back here. And I've discussed in many videos the whole myth, basically, of the suicide gun. But, yeah, we can talk about that later. With the safety on, though, you can't press this in. It's only with the safety off. So already before the war, it was being simplified a bit, but it would stay at a very high quality level through 41, 42. Now these were only made at Nambu's Kakibunji factory. They were never produced elsewhere. And they were never a standard issue, but they were kind of a limited standard, and they were greatly appreciated by pilots and Japanese soldiers in tanks because of their small size and honestly better reliability. But in 43, they would take a downturn. The quality of machining would go down, the ballooning would go down. And in 44, believe it or not, they kind of hit their lowest point. At first, they went to these wood grips. Now, as I said, Kakibunji would stop making Type 14s in that summer to focus on these. And then they would soon introduce these slab wood grips. So they would use these for quite a bit of time. But towards the end of 1944, the quality got so bad, there had to be a bit of a shake-up and a visit from inspectors, and guns from 45 on actually look a little bit better than some of the guns from late 44. But they did continue to introduce more simplifications. For one, they went to very basic rear sights, I guess you could say. They're just little squares. They also introduced the square back design here for the cocking piece instead of the more ornate version. And the magazines were simplified themselves. But overall, it was just a degrading of fit and finish as you would expect. The last new guns seem to have been made around May of 1945, and then in June we enter in the last ditch production of Type 94s. Again, where they were assembling them from what parts they had on hand. So already before the end of the war, they no longer had the capacity to make these. And in total, they built between 71 and 72,000. Not a very big number, but actually a larger number than Japan's previous Type 26, which was a revolver that had been its standard issue for decades. So Japan, again, they didn't put a lot of emphasis on sidearms. And again, with officers buying their own before 1943, they had more of a commercial attitude, and they sold a lot of 32s from Europe and even America to them. And the broom handle Mauser was used by some others. But these were the most common, and really the two largest produced guns in Japan before and during World War II, at least handguns, I should say. And the Type 94 is really much maligned, as is the Type 14. The Type 14 had some mechanical faults, but it was very accurate, if not most powerful. And the Type 94, well, it's not a lot bigger or heavier than this Walther, and it does fire a more powerful cartridge, and it's actually quite reliable. And once more, the sear thing is kind of misunderstood and greatly exaggerated. But that's a story for another video, and I've discussed it before. So that's the status. Much like with Japanese Arasakas, Yeah, they're the roughest, but heck, they were making guns long after Germany had surrendered. So with that, let's wrap things up. Well, I really hope you enjoyed these couple of videos. I thought this would be an interesting topic. Again, nothing really new here, but it's always kind of fun to me to see things side by side. It's interesting. You know, Britain's economies were basically just stick with revolvers, what they knew. Nothing flashy. It worked for them. Russia, they didn't really change the pattern much. They just sped things up a lot to produce these. In fact, they made the most of any of the guns on the table of the Tokarevs, so what they were doing worked, and they served for decades afterwards. Of course, with our Walthers here, even though they were late war examples, both became iconic guns. And the P-38, the quality still stayed quite high. It's actually amazing how kind of far it fell with the PP, considering this would have been more of an officer's pistol, or maybe an aircrewman's pistol. But at least they were still making them. They could have easily just stopped entirely. And the Japanese guns, as rough as they look, they're not dangerous, at least until you get to the last ditches, and even those are nominally safe. Probably the worst part about these is how delicate some of the parts are. The wood grips on the 14. They're much more durable because of the size on the 94. But the 94 has kind of its own eccentricities, including just a complicated disassembly. But they are interesting. And again, this is at a point in the war when really no one else was building them. And they probably introduced the most actual design changes to the guns. Although, you know, Walther did some with the P-38s with the help of Mauser. So, yeah. Again, I could have involved the U.S. and Italy, but trying to keep this sizable video. So let me know what you think, and please share your own late war or 1942 rush gun. Any questions or comments, as always, please do post them below. And as always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support of the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha, and I'll catch you, I don't know, after I have dinner, because I'm getting hungry now, very soon, next time.